They said she wouldn't last the winter. Not in a cruel way. At least, not at first. The way people in small frontier towns say things they've seen proven too many times to doubt. A widow. A child. A piece of land no one else wanted. The arithmetic was simple, and Harrow Hollow had done it before. She arrived on a gray afternoon when the sky sat low and heavy over the frontier hills, the kind of sky that doesn't threaten, it promises. Her wagon held 3 crates, a boy, and a silence between them that had not lifted in months. The boy's name was Owen. He was 9 years old and had not laughed since his father died. Her name was Edith Crane. She had been, before all of this, an engineer's assistant in a city that valued precision above sentiment. She understood load-bearing walls and thermal displacement and the mathematics of shelter. None of that, according to the people watching from the windows of Harrow Hollow, made the slightest difference against a hard winter. But here is what those people did not know. Before that winter was over, 11 of them would owe her their lives. And the one person she had waited for, the one she had saved a space for, almost didn't come at all. She would spend years thinking about that, about how close it had been. Callum Briggs said it first, which meant everyone heard it. He ran the general store, which in a town that size meant he ran most of what mattered. Supplies, credit, information, all of it passed through his hands at one point or another. He was not a violent man. He was something quieter and more dangerous, a man who believed his own certainty completely. He watched Edith climb down from the wagon that first afternoon, Owen behind her. The boy's eyes fixed on the ground the way children's eyes go when they've been asked to carry something too heavy for too long. Callum crossed his arms, looked at the woman, looked at the crates, looked at the deed she'd presented at the county office that morning. 40 acres, 1 collapsed fence line, and a barn that hadn't held livestock in a decade. A widow with a child and no trade, he said, not unkindly to the men standing beside him. She won't see the far side of winter. They nodded, because they had seen this before, because the land did not care about intentions. Edith heard him. She did not look up. She had learned, long before she arrived in Harrow Hollow, that certain words were not worth the energy of a response. That silence, held with dignity, was sometimes the sharpest answer available. She would remember that sentence, though. She would remember it for a very long time. The barn stood at the edge of her property, like something that had already decided to fall and was simply waiting for permission. Timber frame, hand-cut beams, wide and weathered, gaps between the boards wide enough to let winter through without slowing. The roof sagged at its center. One wall leaned east as though it had been listening for something on the other side of the hill and had simply kept leaning. Harrow Hollow called it worthless. Edith walked through it alone that first evening, Owen waiting outside with the dog they hadn't meant to keep. A gray, muzzled old thing Owen had found shivering near the dump pile 3 miles back, and she hadn't had the heart to say no. The boy had named him Biscuit, which was not a dignified name, but dignity had not been the point. Inside the barn, she listened. Old structures speak if you let them, not in words, in pressure, in the way air moves or doesn't move, in the sound a beam makes when the temperature drops. She stood in the center of that broken space and tilted her head slightly. Then she crouched. The floorboards were warped and swollen. She pressed her fingers between 2 of them and felt cold stone beneath. And then something else. Metal. The edge of something buried. She worked for nearly an hour with her hands alone before she pulled it free. A tin box, rusted along every seam. The kind of box someone buries deliberately, not carelessly. Inside, a folded set of papers, brittle at the edges, dense with penciled calculations. And beneath those, a design, precise, detailed, unmistakably intentional. A curved steel structure, half-cylinder in shape, meant to be assembled inside an existing shell. Notations along the margins in a hand she didn't recognize. Measurements, load estimates, thermal retention calculations that matched, almost exactly, the principles her father had taught her 20 years before. At the bottom of the final page, in smaller lettering, a name and a date, and nothing more. Whoever had drawn these plans had never built them. She sat on the cold barn floor for a long time, the papers in her lap, the wind moving through the gaps above her. She did not yet know who had drawn them. She did not yet know why the work had stopped. But she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only to people who have run out of options, that she was holding something she was meant to find. Owen appeared in the doorway, biscuit pressed against his legs. "Can we really live here, Mama?" She looked up at her son, 9 years old and carrying his father's absence like a stone in his chest. He hadn't cried much. That worried her more than crying would have. Children who don't cry have found somewhere else to put the weight, and that somewhere is usually inside them. She looked down at the plans in her hands. Her father had been a mining engineer from a long line of men who understood what stone and steel could hold. He had taught her, on evenings when the light lasted long enough, that heat was not magic. It was mass. That shelter was not luck. It was geometry. That cold was not an enemy to be fought, but a condition to be understood. "My father taught me," she said slowly, "that the shape of a thing determines what it can survive." Owen waited. She looked up at the rafters, at the broken geometry of a structure that had been many things and could become something else entirely. "We're going to finish what someone else started," she said, "and then this is going to be our home." Owen looked around the barn, at the gaps in the walls, at the sagging roof, at the cold stone floor. "It doesn't look like much," he said. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." She folded the plans carefully and placed them inside her coat, against her chest, where the warmth of her body would keep the old paper from growing brittle in the night air. "It never does," she said. "Not at the beginning." Biscuit walked past Owen into the barn, circled twice, and lay down at Edith's feet with the heavy sigh of a creature that has been moving too long and has finally decided to stop. Owen watched the dog. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the absence of something dark that had been there since the funeral. Edith noticed. She said nothing. Some things are too fragile to name out loud. She stood, brushed the dust from her knees, and looked once more at the barn around her. The broken rafters, the tilted walls, the cold that moved through it like a slow tide. She was terrified. She did not let Owen see that. Not because she wanted to deceive him, but because a child needs to believe his mother has already calculated the way through. Even when she hasn't. Even when she's standing in a broken barn in a town that has already decided she will fail, holding a dead man's plans against her chest and calling it a beginning. Outside, the gray sky had darkened toward evening. The hills had gone quiet. The wind moving through the gaps smelled like snow. Not yet, but coming. Patient. Inevitable. Harrow Hollow had already made its judgment. Edith Crane was just getting started. The first supply shipment did not arrive on time. That was the first thing that went wrong. It would not be the last. She had ordered the steel sections through the rail depot 3 days after finding the plans. Curved panels, ribbed for strength, pre-cut to dimensions she had calculated herself on the back of the dead man's original drawings. The clerk at the depot had looked at her order the way people look at something they don't understand and have decided not to try. He wrote it down without comment. He said it would arrive within the week. It did not arrive within the week. It did not arrive the week after that. What arrived instead was the cold. It came the way serious cold always comes in that part of the world. Not as a storm, not with warning, but as a simple and absolute fact. One morning, the temperature was merely uncomfortable. The next morning, it was something else entirely. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The kind that settles in and waits. The barn offered almost nothing by way of protection. Wind moved through the gaps between the boards as freely as it moved across the open hills. The floor was stone beneath rotted wood. The roof held barely, but held meant only that it remained above them, not that it provided warmth, not that it sealed anything out. Edith had prepared for difficulty. She had not fully prepared for this. She built the fire small and careful, pressed against the base of the eastern wall where the stone was thickest and the wind hit least directly. She kept Owen close. She rationed what she had: a sack of dried beans, a tin of salt crackers, a small portion of cured meat she had bought at the general store on her first day, when Callum Briggs had watched her count out coins with the quiet attention of a man confirming what he already believed. On the second night, Owen's forehead was warm. By the third morning, it was hot. She pressed her palm to his face in the gray pre-dawn light and felt his skin burning beneath her hand, and something in her chest went very still and very cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the barn. He was breathing. He was conscious. But his eyes had gone glassy with the particular look of a child whose body is working too hard on something it shouldn't have to work on at all. She had almost nothing left to feed him. The beans required more water than she could comfortably heat. The crackers were too dry for a child with a fever. She had 3 matches remaining in the tin she'd brought from the city. She had counted them that morning with deliberate calm, because panic is a luxury, and she could not afford it. 3 matches. She sat back on her heels and looked at her son and thought about her father. He had been a practical man, not cold, not unfeeling, but practical in the way of people who have learned that sentiment, left unattended, becomes its own kind of disaster. He had grown up in mining country and learned early that the land does not negotiate. You either understood it or you didn't, and the ones who didn't were the ones who didn't come back. He had taught her things that no one around her had thought worth teaching a girl. He had shown her how to read stone for heat retention, which surfaces absorbed warmth and which ones shed it. He had shown her how to build a fire, not for drama, but for efficiency, low and concentrated, burning for duration rather than spectacle. He had shown her how to make a broth from almost nothing, bones if you had them, or sinew, or even the cartilage from small animals. Because heat and liquid together could hold a sick body up when nothing else could. She looked around the barn. She had no bones. But the previous afternoon, setting Biscuit's food down near the eastern wall, she had noticed something in the far corner, half buried under a drift of old hay. A rabbit, dead, frozen solid, almost certainly there for weeks. She had noted it and moved on, because at that moment she had more pressing concerns. Now she crossed the barn, Owen watching her from his blanket, and crouched over the frozen shape. It was small. There was almost nothing to it. But almost nothing, rendered down over a long, slow heat, becomes something. Her mother had taught her that. Her father had confirmed it. Waste nothing. Understand what you have before you decide you don't have enough. She used one match. She kept the fire low, the way her father had shown her. She boiled water in the tin pot she'd packed at the bottom of the second crate. She held the frozen carcass over the heat until it softened enough to work with. She rendered it down to liquid, thin, pale, not quite broth in any meaningful sense, but warm and present and real. Owen drank it without complaint. By the time the light changed in the late afternoon, winter light, gray and sideways, the kind that gives illumination without warmth, his fever had not broken, but it had plateaued. His eyes were clearer. He asked for Biscuit, and Biscuit, who had spent the morning pressed against Owen's blankets with the gravity of a creature that understands when it is needed, lifted his gray head and thumped his tail once on the stone floor. "Good dog," Owen said. His voice was thin, but it was his. Edith sat back against the wall and closed her eyes. She rested in the way people rest when they are running on something other than ordinary energy, something older, something borrowed from necessity itself. By the following morning, the fever had broken. By the morning after that, the steel arrived. She did not waste a single hour. The panels came in sections, each one numbered according to the system she had specified, curved and ribbed and heavier than they looked. She unloaded them herself, Owen watching from the barn doorway, wrapped in 2 blankets, Biscuit beside him, like a sentry who had decided his post was permanent. She had expected someone to offer help. No one did. That was fine. She had not come to Harrow Hollow expecting help. The assembly followed the dead man's plans, modified in several places where her own calculations differed. She had more current knowledge of the materials, and she had made adjustments based on the specific dimensions of the barn's interior. The principle remained his. The execution was hers. She worked from first light until she could no longer see, which in winter came earlier than she would have liked. She worked in silence mostly, occasionally narrating steps to Owen, who had begun sitting closer each day, watching with eyes that had grown sharp with attention. "Why curved?" he asked on the 3rd day. "Because a curve distributes pressure," she said, tightening a bolt. "A flat surface takes the force directly. A curve sends it around and down. Same principle as an arch in a stone bridge." Owen considered this. Grandpa built bridges. He understood the same idea. Shape determines strength, not size. Shape. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that why you're not just building walls?" She looked at her son, 9 years old, sitting on an overturned crate in a cold barn, asking a question that went straight to the center of the engineering problem she was solving. "Exactly why," she said. He nodded and went back to watching. And something in the watching was different now. Not just observation, but absorption. The way children learn when they don't know they're learning. Callum Briggs came on the 4th day. He didn't come alone. He brought with him a young man named Pierce, early 20s, the kind of young who mistakes loudness for confidence, and a farmer named Gideon who had the look of a man who had come mostly out of curiosity and was trying to appear as though he hadn't. They stood in the barn doorway and looked at the structure taking shape inside. The steel ribs rose in a series of clean arcs. The basic shell was already visible, a half-cylinder, low and deliberate, sitting inside the broken timber frame of the old barn, like something that had been waiting inside it all along. Callum looked at it for a long moment. "Crane's Folly," he said finally. Not loud, not cruel exactly, just certain. The voice of a man naming something he believes he understands completely. Pierce laughed. Gideon said nothing, but his eyes moved across the structure with an attention that was harder to read. Edith kept her focus on the bolt she was tightening. "You're welcome to watch," she said. "I can't offer you much else." "How do you plan to heat it?" Callum asked. "Small stove, offset from center. Steel doesn't hold heat. Foam does. And mass does. And contained air does." She set down the wrench and met his gaze directly. "The steel holds the shape. The shape holds the heat." Callum studied her with the particular skepticism of a man who has decided the conclusion before examining the evidence. "It won't work," he said. "I know you believe that," Edith said, and returned to work. They stood there a few minutes longer. Pierce made one more comment, something about the structure looking like a culvert. Gideon glanced once more at the rising arches, then followed the others out. Edith heard their footsteps cross the yard, heard Callum say something she couldn't make out, heard Pierce laugh again. She tightened the next bolt, and the next. Owen, from his crate in the corner, watched the doorway after the men had gone. "Will it work, Mama?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "How do you know?" She thought about her father, about the dead man's plans pressed against her chest in the cold dark on the first night, about the way the panels fit together with a precision that felt, somehow, like an answer. Because the man who designed it understood something real, she said, and real things work. Owen turned back to the structure. "Okay," he said, simply, completely, the way children accept things when they have decided to trust. Winifred Oakes came the following week. She appeared in the doorway without announcement, a small woman with white hair and the unhurried manner of someone who has long since stopped caring what impression she makes. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to contain sweet potatoes, cooked, warm, wrapped in a dishcloth that still held some of their heat from her stove. She set the bundle down just inside the doorway without entering. "I'm not here to talk," she said. "I disagree with most of what passes for conversation in this town, and I've gotten old enough to stop pretending otherwise." She looked at the structure, at the arching steel ribs, at the foam Edith had begun applying to the interior surface, thick, expanding, sealing every seam with the patient attention the work required. She looked for a long time. "You found the tin box," Winifred said. It was not a question. Edith set down her brush and turned. The old woman's face was composed. Not closed. Composed. There is a difference. Closed means there is nothing left inside. Composed means there is a great deal inside, and it is being held deliberately. "The plans," Edith said carefully. "You know whose they were." "My husband's." Winifred looked at the ribs again, at the graceful upward curve of the steel. "He spent 2 winters drawing them. He understood what this barn could become. He understood the physics of it, the insulation, the thermal mass, the way a curved space retains warmth differently than a square one." A pause. "He died before he could build it. A winter storm came early one year. He was outside when it hit. He didn't make it back." The barn was very quiet. Owen, in his corner, had gone completely still. Winifred looked at Edith. Her eyes were dry. She had finished grieving in private, long ago, and what remained was something harder and cleaner. He drew those plans so that I would be safe, she said. So that if something happened to him, there would be a way. She paused. But I didn't know how to build it, and no one in this town thought it was worth trying to learn. She picked up the empty cloth and folded it neatly. Finish it, she said. That's all I came to say. She turned and walked back across the yard, small and unhurried, her boots leaving clean prints in the thin snow that had fallen overnight. Edith stood in the doorway and watched her go. Owen appeared at her elbow. Did she know him? He asked. The man who drew the plans? She was married to him, Edith said. Owen thought about this. So she's been waiting a long time for someone to build it. Edith looked at the steel arches rising inside the old barn, at the shape that had lived in a tin box under a rotted floor for years, at the structure that had been planned by a man for a woman he loved and never completed. Yes, she said quietly, she has. The crisis came in the third week, on a Tuesday, without preamble. Callum Briggs arrived with a document. He was dressed for occasion, his good coat, his hat set level. He had brought with him a man named Stowe, who introduced himself as representing a property concern and spoke with the careful neutrality of someone paid to deliver uncomfortable information in a voice that cannot be argued with in court. The document cited a disputed boundary line, an old survey, a discrepancy between what had been recorded and what had been sold. The property, Stowe explained with professional evenness, was subject to a challenge that would need to be resolved before any permanent structure could be considered legally established. If Edith could not demonstrate clear title within 30 days, the disputed parcel, including the barn and everything on it, would revert to the petitioning party. Callum stood behind Stowe and said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence said it for him. Edith read the document twice. She asked 2 questions, specific procedural questions about the challenge timeline and the avenue for response, and Stowe answered them in the same careful, neutral voice, and then they were gone, and the barn was quiet again. She stood in the center of the structure for a long time. The steel ribs rose around her, solid and clean. The foam-sealed walls held the cold out with a reliability that no one in Harrow Hollow had believed possible. The small stove in the corner burned low and steady. Everything she had built, every bolt tightened, every seam sealed, every calculation confirmed, stood precisely as she had intended, and it could all be taken. That night, after Owen was asleep, she sat at the small table she'd built from barn scraps and took out a piece of paper. She had a younger sister in the city, married, settled, in a house with a proper furnace, and neighbors who didn't measure your survival odds aloud. She had not written to her since arriving. There had been nothing to say that she wanted to say. Now she wrote. She wrote about the cold, about Owen's fever and the 3 matches and the rabbit that had been almost nothing and had been enough. She wrote about the steel structure and the dead man's plans and Winifred Oakes and her composed dry eyes. She wrote about the document and Callum Briggs standing behind the property man in his good coat. And then, at the bottom of the page, she wrote, I have been thinking about coming back. She put the pen down. She looked at the words. She did not hear Owen get up. He was quiet in the way of children who have learned that adults sometimes need to not be startled. He appeared at her elbow in his socks, Biscuit behind him, both of them looking at her with the particular attention of creatures that know something is wrong before they know what it is. Owen looked at the letter. He couldn't read her writing from that angle, but he could read her face, and whatever he read, there was enough. He put his hand over hers on the table, small hand, warm. Still a child's hand, but with a steadiness in it that had not been there before they came here. Papa always said you were the smartest person he ever knew, Owen said. He said it all the time. He said it like it was just a fact, like the sky is blue. A pause. I still believe that. Edith looked at her son. Owen went back to bed. She sat alone with the letter for a long time. The stove burned low. The steel walls held the warmth without effort. Outside, the cold pressed against the barn's old boards. Testing, patient, permanent. She picked up the letter. She held it over the lamp flame until it caught, and then she held it by one corner and watched it burn down to nothing, and then she set the ash in the stove grate and went to bed. In the morning, she went back to work. Sheriff Damon Frey arrived on a Wednesday with no stated reason. He said he was conducting a safety check on structures in the outer properties, which was not an implausible thing for a sheriff to do, except that Edith had made several trips into town in the past weeks and had not heard of any other outer property receiving such attention. He was a quiet man, broad through the shoulders, with the deliberate manner of someone who has learned to take up only as much space as he needs. His wife had died 3 winters past. The town knew this the way small towns know everything, thoroughly, permanently, and with a sensitivity that fades faster than it should. He walked through the barn. He examined the structure carefully, in the manner of a person who is actually looking rather than confirming what they expected to see. "What's the R value on that foam?" he asked. She told him. He nodded, as though the number confirmed something. "And the thermal mass? You're relying on the steel skin plus the foam layer?" "And the floor," she said, "raised and sealed. Cold comes up from the ground first. Most people don't account for that." He crouched and examined the floor seam. He pressed his palm to the steel wall and held it there for a moment. "It's warm," he said, surprised in spite of himself. "That's the point." He stood. He looked around the space, the clean arches, the sealed surfaces, the small stove burning with quiet efficiency in the offset corner. "I've been a sheriff in the cold country for 11 years, he said. "I've pulled people out of structures that looked better than this on the outside and failed completely when it mattered." A pause. "This is different." "Yes," she said. He didn't leave. He walked the perimeter, examined the bolted joints, studied the foam application along the upper curve. He asked several more technical questions, each specific, none performative. He was not pretending to understand. He was genuinely trying to. That was, she realized, uncommon. At some point, he picked up a wrench from the tool pile and began tightening a series of joints along the north curve she hadn't gotten to yet. He did it without asking, without ceremony. He simply saw work that needed doing and did it. Owen appeared from the outer section where he'd been stacking lumber, took one look at the sheriff working alongside his mother, and went very deliberately back to stacking lumber, in the specific way of a child pretending not to notice something he has absolutely noticed. Frey stayed 3 hours. He came back Thursday, and the Friday after that. He always had a reason. The reason was never quite sufficient to explain the duration of the visit. Edith noticed. She said nothing. Some things are better approached from the side, slowly, the way you approach something you don't want to startle. It was Winifred who said it plainly, because Winifred had reached an age where plain speech was more efficient than its alternatives. She had begun coming every few days, never for long, always with something: a handful of dried herbs, a jar of preserved apples, a piece of information delivered without preamble. On this particular afternoon, she arrived while Frey was there. assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, set down a tin of shortbread, and said to Edith, "He comes more often than his duties require." "I know," Edith said. "And you don't mind." "I didn't say that." Winifred considered this. "Did not say it either." Owen, from his corner, coughed in a way that was not a cough. Edith looked at her son. Owen looked at the wall. Winifred picked up her empty basket with the satisfaction of a woman who has accomplished what she came to accomplish and sees no reason to linger. At the door, she paused. "He's a good man," she said. "The kind that takes time to see because they're not trying to be seen." She nodded once. "My husband was that kind." Then she left, and the barn was quiet again, and somewhere in the outer structure, Owen was very deliberately not saying anything at all. It was the day after Winifred's visit that she brought Edith the rest. She arrived in the morning, earlier than usual, carrying nothing except herself, and a deliberate expression that said she had made a decision and was going to see it through. "There's more in the box," she said. Edith looked up. "I kept the rest. I wasn't ready to give it before." Winifred set a folded packet on the workbench. Papers, older than the originals, tied with a piece of cord that had faded from whatever color it had once been. "My husband kept a journal. Every calculation, every mistake, every revision, everything he tried that didn't work, and why." She looked at the packet. The things that didn't work are in there too. That might be the most important part. Edith untied the cord carefully. The papers unfolded to reveal page after page of dense, careful notations. A man working through a problem over years, documenting failures alongside solutions with equal precision. She read for a long time. There, in the margins of the 14th page, was the thermal adjustment she had been trying to calculate for the past week. He had worked it out completely. He had even noted the error he'd made on his first attempt, and the correction. It was exactly what she had been missing. She looked up. Winifred met her gaze with those composed, dry eyes. "Finish it," the old woman said, for the second time, with the same weight as the first. "I will," Edith said, and she meant it more completely than she had meant anything in a long time. Not because she wasn't afraid, not because the legal challenge had resolved, or the town had changed its assessment, or the cold had softened into something manageable, but because the man who had come before her had failed and documented his failure honestly, and left the correction for whoever came after. And she was whoever came after. And that was enough. She went back to work. The steel held its shape. The foam sealed every gap. The small stove burned low and efficient in the corner. Outside, the sky pressed down gray and permanent, and the hills rolled away into cold, and Harrow Hollow went about its business of doubting. Inside the barn, Edith Crane built something that would outlast all of it. She just didn't know yet how soon that would matter. Winifred Oakes stopped coming on a Thursday. Edith understood before she was told. There is a particular quality to the absence of someone who has been reliably present. Not loud, not dramatic, simply a shape that is missing from the air. Winifred had come every few days without fail, always with something, always without ceremony. When she did not appear Thursday, Edith noted it. When Friday passed the same way, she knew. The boy who brought word was no more than 12, sent by the neighbor who shared a fence line with Winifred's property. He stood in the barn doorway with his hat in his hands and delivered his message with the careful gravity of a child who has been told something serious and is trying to carry it correctly. Winifred had fallen in the night. Not a catastrophic fall, not the kind that ends things immediately, but the kind that reveals what has been quietly failing beneath the surface for longer than anyone noticed. She was in her bed. She would not be going out in the cold again this season. Edith thanked the boy. She gave him 2 of the shortbread biscuits Winifred had brought on her last visit, which seemed right in a way she couldn't have explained. He took them with both hands and left. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, looking out at the yard. The cold was absolute, the kind that makes the air itself feel solid, as though moving through it requires more effort than it should. The hills beyond the fence line were the color of old iron. The sky pressed down without texture or depth. She had one ally in this town, one person who had seen what she was building and understood it. One person who had looked at the steel arches and the foam-sealed walls and the dead man's plans and said simply, "Finish it." And now that person was in her bed. The legal challenge from Callum Briggs was still unresolved, and Damon Frey had not come in 4 days. That last part she had not been thinking about. She thought about it now. The message from Frey came not in person, but through the boy who ran errands for the general store. A different boy, older, with the practiced indifference of someone who has learned to deliver information without inflection. The sheriff had been called before the town council. The message did not say why. It did not need to. Harrow Hollow was a small town, and small towns run on a social economy as precise and unforgiving as any financial one. A man in Frey's position, elected, accountable, dependent on the goodwill of the people he served, could absorb a certain amount of association with an outsider. A widow building something unusual on disputed property was one thing. A sheriff who visited her regularly, who spent hours in her barn, who was seen by enough people to make the observation general knowledge. That was another thing entirely. The council would not have needed to say much. They rarely did. The shape of their meaning would have been clear enough. Frey did not come the next day, or the day after. Edith sent no word. She had not asked him to come the first time, and she would not ask now. That was not pride, exactly. It was something more structural, an understanding that certain things cannot be built on the foundation of one person's willingness to withstand social pressure. If he came, it would have to be his choice, freely made, not pulled toward her by need or guilt. She went back to work. The foam application was nearly complete. The upper curve of the structure now held warmth in a way that was measurable. She tracked it each morning with the small thermometer she'd packed in the bottom of the 3rd crate, and the numbers confirmed what she had calculated. The interior temperature stabilized within a range that was, by the standards of the surrounding country, extraordinary. Not tropical, not even warm in any conventional sense, but stable, consistent, resistant to the enormous fluctuations that made conventional structures in this climate so dangerous. She worked through the days Frey didn't come. She worked because the alternative to working was thinking, and thinking, without something useful to direct it toward, had a tendency to go to places she couldn't afford. But the night she let herself fully understand he wasn't coming, the night she stopped waiting for the sound of boots on the yard, she sat by the small stove and looked at the curved walls and felt the particular loneliness of a person who has been almost not alone and has returned to being alone again. It was not the same as before. Before had been simpler. She had not known what it felt like to have someone listen to her explain a load calculation with genuine interest. She had not known what it felt like to look up from her work and find someone there who had simply decided to be useful without making a performance of it. Now she knew, and the knowing made the absence heavier. Owen came and sat beside her. He said nothing. He leaned against her arm with the complete physical trust of a child who has decided that closeness is its own form of statement. Biscuit lay across their feet. After a while, Owen said, "He'll come back." "You don't know that," Edith said. "No," Owen agreed, "but I think it anyway." She put her arm around him. The stove burned low. The steel walls held the warmth without effort, which was the whole point of them, and she was grateful for that, at least. She was grateful for the thing that worked even when other things didn't. It was 3 days after Frey stopped coming that she found the rest of what was in the box. She had assumed when Winifred brought the journal that she had seen everything. The plans, the notations, the documented failures and corrections. It had seemed complete. But she had been working from the papers with the urgency of someone solving an immediate problem, and she had not examined every layer of the original tin box itself on a quiet afternoon when Owen was at his lessons. She had arranged for him to work through a correspondence curriculum, materials that arrived by mail, and kept him occupied in a structured way that seemed to matter to him. She sat down with the empty tin and looked at it properly for the first time. The bottom was not solid. It was a false floor, thin, fitted so precisely that it had read as the base of the box in every previous handling. She worked the edge up with a small flat tool, and beneath it found 3 folded pages that were older than anything else she had uncovered. Letters. Not from the man who had drawn the plans, from someone before him. The handwriting was different, more formal, the ink more deeply faded. The language was the language of an earlier generation, careful, structured, with the precision of a person educated in a time when letters were considered a form of accomplishment. The letters described a structure, not the steel-vaulted construction from the plans. Something older, built before those materials were available, but the same principle, the same understanding of curved space and thermal mass, and the way a sealed interior resists cold in ways that a conventional structure cannot. The writer described watching a similar construction survive a winter that destroyed everything around it. Described the principle as something passed down to him from his own father, who had learned it in a different country, in different materials, in a different century. The knowledge was not new. It was old. Older than the town. Older than the territory. It had moved through generations, adapting to whatever materials were available, to whoever was willing to understand it. It had been here, waiting, through 2 people before her. She sat with the letters for a long time. There is a particular feeling that comes from discovering you are part of a chain rather than a beginning. It is not the feeling of being small. It is something almost opposite. The feeling of being held up by more than your own effort. The feeling of a long line of knowing at your back. She folded the letters carefully and placed them with the rest. Then she returned to work with a steadiness she had not felt in days. The signs appeared on a morning when the sky did something that had no ordinary name. She had stepped outside before dawn to check the barn's outer walls, a habit she had developed, a daily inspection of how the structure held its relationship with the environment. The air was still in the specific way that sometimes precedes movement. Not calm. Held. She looked up. The sky to the northwest was a color she associated with bruising. Not quite gray, not quite yellow. A particular tone that sits at the edge of visible color and makes the eye work harder than it should have to. She studied it for a long time. Her father had described a sky like this once. He had seen it twice in his life, he said, and both times what followed had been significant. Not just cold, not just a storm in the ordinary sense, something that reorganized the landscape, something that tested structures, not for comfort, but for survival. She went back inside and checked her thermometer. Then she checked the barometer she had hung on the eastern wall, an instrument most people in Harrow Hollow didn't own and wouldn't have known how to read. The needle had dropped overnight in a way that was not gradual. A departure. Biscuit was pacing. He had been pacing since before she woke. She had heard him in her half-sleep, the quiet, rhythmic sound of a large animal moving in a small space. Now she watched him, back and forth across the inner structure, pausing at the sealed door, pausing at the south wall, resuming. His ears were up and rotating in the manner of a creature receiving information on a frequency that human senses can't quite reach. Owen stood in the inner doorway, watching the dog. "He's scared," Owen said. "He's worried," Edith said. "Scared animals freeze or run. Worried animals pace." "What's he worried about?" She looked at the barometer again, at the sky through the gap she'd left in the barn's eastern board, which she kept specifically to read conditions without opening the main door and losing heat. "Something coming," she said. She made a decision before she had fully articulated it to herself. The way decisions sometimes arrive ahead of their reasoning, which is the body's way of being faster than the mind. She went into town. She went to the general store first because it was central, because people gathered there, and because if she was going to speak to as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time, it made structural sense to begin at the place where the most people moved through. Callum Briggs was behind the counter. 3 men were by the stove. A woman she knew by sight but not by name was looking at bolts of fabric near the window. "There's a storm coming," Edith said. "Not a regular winter storm. Something serious. I'd recommend bringing in everything outside, securing any structure with gaps in the walls or roof, and not traveling after dark today." Callum looked at her with the expression he reserved for her, not cruel, not angry, simply the expression of a man who has categorized something and sees no reason to recategorize it. "Based on what?" he said. "Barometric drop overnight. Sky color at dawn. Animal behavior." She paused. "And what I know about how this kind of cold behaves when it builds." "You've been here one season," he said. "The principles don't change with the location." One of the men by the stove, an older man, heavy-set, with the particular stillness of someone who spends a great deal of time outdoors and has learned to conserve movement, turned slightly and looked at her. He said nothing, but he looked at her with a quality of attention that was different from the others. "The sky looked strange this morning," the woman at the fabric said quietly. "Clouds do strange things in winter," Callum said. Edith held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked around at everyone in the room. "I'm telling you what I see," she said. "What you do with it is your decision." She went to the next house and the next. At most of them, she stood in a doorway and said the same thing. The same information, the same recommendation, the same acknowledgement that the decision was theirs. Some people listened politely, some with genuine attention. Some closed the door before she finished. At Reverend Aldis's house, a white-painted structure directly across from the church, immaculate, the woodpile perfectly stacked, she made her full case. Aldis listened with his hands folded. He was a man who had cultivated patience as a professional instrument. He waited until she was finished, then spoke. "We appreciate the concern," he said, in the voice he used when he was not actually speaking to you, but was performing the act of speaking to you for an audience of his own conscience. But this community has weathered many winters. We place our trust in Providence and in the resilience of these people, rather than in barometric readings and the behavior of animals. A pause. It would perhaps be better, going forward, if concerns of this nature were directed to the appropriate authorities. I spoke to the sheriff, she said. Then I'm sure he will take it under advisement. She looked at him, at his folded hands and his composed face and his white house with the perfect woodpile that would not be nearly enough if what was coming was what she believed it was. She did not argue. Argument requires a shared foundation of what counts as evidence, and they did not have one. Reverend, she said, I hope I'm wrong. I'm sure you mean well, he said, and closed the door. She was standing outside the last house on the eastern edge of town when she heard Pierce, the young man who had come with Callum to the barn on the first day, call out from across the yard. The barn woman's afraid of sunshine, he shouted, to the general amusement of the two friends beside him. She looked at the sky, which was no longer the bruised yellow-gray of early morning, but something darker, something with more intention in it. A sky that had made a decision and was moving toward it. She walked back to the barn. Owen was at the door when she arrived, Biscuit pressed against his legs. Did they listen? He asked. Some of them, she said. What about the rest? She looked at the hills, which had gone a particular shade of dark that had nothing to do with the hour, at the way the air had stopped moving entirely, that absolute stillness that sometimes comes just before something very large begins. Let's get inside, she said, and make sure everything is sealed. Owen looked at Biscuit. The dog had stopped pacing. He stood at the barn entrance, facing northwest, completely still, ears forward. He knows, Owen said. Yes, Edith said, he does. They went inside. She spent the next hours in a state of deliberate, focused preparation that left no room for the fear present underneath it. She checked every seal. She checked the stove, the fuel supply, the water barrel positioned near the stove's warmth. She checked the foam along every curve for gaps she might have missed. She checked the floor. She had, without quite planning it, built a structure that could hold more than 2 people. The design accommodated it. The curved space was 20 feet across, 30 feet long, with the efficient geometry of something designed to maximize interior volume within a minimal shell. She had thought of it in terms of air volume and thermal stability. She had not, until this moment, thought of it in terms of how many people could fit inside it if they needed to.
11, she estimated. Perhaps 12 if they sat close.
She did not let herself think too long about whether it would come to that. She made Owen eat. She made herself eat. She added a careful measure of fuel to the stove and set it to the slow, sustained burn she had calibrated over weeks. The burn that maintained rather than spiked, that treated heat as something to be conserved rather than generated on demand. Owen did his lessons. Biscuit lay by the inner door. The light outside changed at 4 in the afternoon. Changed is too small a word. It transformed. It went from winter gray to something that had color in it, a deep, suffused amber that turned the snow outside the gap, a shade that looked almost warm, which it absolutely was not. It was the light that comes when something enormous is blocking ordinary light and replacing it with its own. When what is coming is large enough to have its own atmosphere. Then the light went away entirely. Then the wind began. It did not begin as a howl. That is a storyteller's word for something described from a safe distance. What it began as was a pressure, a change in how the air felt against the barn's outer walls, a sound that was low and enormous, the roar of something that does not need to announce itself because it is simply, irreversibly, here. The barn's outer walls took it first. She had understood from the beginning that the old barn would not stop what came at it. What she had understood, what the dead man's plans had understood, what her father's teaching had understood, was that stopping was not the goal. Reduction was the goal. The barn's outer walls, however gap-riddled, absorbed the first force of the wind before it reached the steel structure inside. Not all of it, not most of it, but enough. The way a breakwater absorbs the first violence of a wave and delivers something lesser to the shore. Inside the steel-vaulted space, the sound was present but distant. The temperature held. The stove flame did not even waver. She had positioned it in an offset alcove specifically to keep the combustion zone away from any air movement that might penetrate. Owen sat beside her with his hand on Biscuit's back. She kept the stove at its calibrated burn. She did not increase it. This was the counterintuitive truth at the center of everything she had built. That the impulse to respond to greater cold with greater fire was the thing that failed people. Greater fire meant greater consumption, meant shorter supply, meant a moment, eventually, when the fire went out. And a structure that had been running hot and then went cold dropped faster than one that had been running steady all along. She kept it steady. Owen fell asleep against her arm around late evening. Biscuit remained alert by the door with the patience of a creature that has decided its job is to be the first to know. The storm did not peak and pass. It arrived and settled the way serious things do, not as an event, but as a new condition. She could feel, in the deep steadiness of the steel walls around her, that this would be sustained, not hours. Days, possibly. The first sound she did not expect came 2 hours into the storm. Not the wind, not the settling of the old barn's timbers under load. Something different. A knock. She and Owen both heard it. His eyes opened immediately, the way children's eyes open when they have been half listening, even in sleep. She looked at the door. Biscuit was already standing. She crossed the space and opened the inner door into the barn's outer shell. The cold hit her immediately. She moved to the barn's main door and worked the latch free. The woman on the other side was Callum Briggs's wife. She was holding their youngest child, a girl no older than 4, wrapped in everything the woman had been able to get onto her in the available time, which had clearly not been enough. The child's lips had gone the color of old ash. The woman's hands, gripping the child, were shaking in a way that was no longer voluntary. Behind her, Callum Briggs stood in the snow. He was a large man, and the wind was moving him. That alone said everything. The woman looked at Edith. She didn't speak. Her eyes said everything a voice would have said. And more. Edith stepped back. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." That was all. No elaboration. No reference to the document. The legal challenge. The name he had given her barn. The certainty with which he had delivered his verdict about her survival. None of it.
"Come in. Get warm."
They came in. The second knock came 20 minutes later. The third, 20 minutes after that. The Reverend arrived alone, his good coat inadequate, his hat lost somewhere between his house and her door. He stepped inside and stood in the outer barn and put his hand against the wall of the steel structure and held it there, feeling the warmth that lived inside it. The fourth and fifth arrivals came together. A farming family from the northern edge of the property line, 3 of them, The children wrapped in a horse blanket that had not been enough. The sixth was the older man from the general store, the heavy-set man who had looked at her that morning with careful attention. He had listened, or had remembered, or had both. 7, 8, 9. The space filled in the way such spaces fill, not with arrangement or planning, but with the arithmetic of necessity. People moved close because close was warmer, not because they chose each other. Callum Briggs sat against the south wall. The Reverend sat against the north. Between them, in the curved middle of the space, their children lay together on the blankets Edith and Owen spread across the floor. The 10th and 11th arrivals came within minutes of each other, both from the far western properties, both showing the signs of exposure that meant they had left later than they should have. 11 people, plus Edith, plus Owen. The 12th space, she had not consciously set it aside, but it was there, remained empty. She looked at the door each time a sound came from outside. Each time it was the storm, settling into its new identity as a sustained and absolute condition, rather than an event with a beginning and an end. Damon Frey did not come. She stopped looking at the door. She turned to the people in her barn, in her structure, in the space she had built from a dead man's plans and her father's teaching and her own refusal to do the simpler thing. 11 people who had not believed she would see the far side of winter. And the winter was not done yet, but they were warm. "Let's see about getting everyone settled," she said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady, and the steadiness was real. Not performance, not suppression, but the genuine calm that sometimes comes when a person is doing exactly what they were built to do, even if they didn't know until this moment that they were built to do it. Owen was already moving, helping the smallest child find a place nearest the stove. Biscuit moved through the space with the gravity of an animal that understands its role, settling near the children, warm and present and certain, the way he had been certain since the day Owen brought him home from the dump pile, and Edith had looked at his gray muzzle and thought, "We cannot afford this." They could not afford not to have him. She checked the stove, steady. She checked the walls, holding. Outside, the storm pressed against the old barn with everything it had. Inside, 11 people, 12, counting Edith, breathed the same air in a space that had been built for exactly this moment, by a woman no one had believed, from plans drawn by a man no one remembered, guided by knowledge passed down through generations of people who understood one simple and enduring truth. The shape of a thing determines what it can survive. The first hours were the hardest to organize. Not because people were difficult, they were past difficult, past argument, past the social calculations that had governed every interaction between them and Edith since she arrived in Harrow Hollow. Exposure has a way of stripping all of that. When a person has stood in wind that moves them against their will and cold that works through every layer they own, the social economy of a small town becomes briefly, entirely irrelevant. What remains is the body, and what the body needs, and whether someone is willing to provide it. Edith was willing. She moved through the space with the focused efficiency of someone who has been preparing for exactly this, even without knowing it. Blankets distributed by need. The children first, then the elderly, then the adults who had arrived showing the gray-white patches on exposed skin that meant the cold had already begun its work. She knew what those patches meant. Her father had taught her that too. One winter evening when the lesson had seemed theoretical and now did not. She guided the affected hands and faces toward the warmth of the space itself, the ambient, even sustained warmth that the structure produced not through drama, but through design. She explained this briefly to the people who asked. There was a time for teaching and a time for doing, and right now, the proportion favored doing. Owen moved alongside her. She had not asked him to. He had simply stood up when she stood up and begun doing what needed doing, carrying blankets, pouring water from the barrel into the tin cup she'd stacked on the shelf, guiding the smallest children to the warmest part of the floor with the patient authority of a boy who has spent weeks in this space and knows exactly where the heat pools and where it doesn't. He was 9 years old. He moved through that crowded, desperate space as though he had been doing it for years. Edith watched him for a moment. Just a moment, because moments were all she could afford, and felt something she did not have a word for. Not pride, exactly. Deeper than pride. The feeling of watching a person become who they were going to be, without knowing that's what you were watching. She went back to work. Callum Briggs sat against the south wall with his wife beside him and his youngest daughter in his lap. The girl had stopped shaking. Color had returned to her lips slowly over the course of an hour, with the reliable patience of a body that is warming from the inside out rather than being forced from the outside in. Callum had not spoken since he entered. He sat with his back against the steel wall, which was warm, which was the thing no one had believed, the thing he had dismissed with the certainty of a man who had never needed to question what he already knew, and held his daughter and studied the floor. His wife had spoken. She had said thank you twice, the second time with a directness that made clear she was saying it for both of them, that she understood he was not yet able to say it himself, and that she was not willing to wait indefinitely for that ability to arrive. Edith had nodded and moved on. The gratitude existed. The shelter existed. Both were simply true. It was, she found, surprisingly easy to hold no triumph in her chest. She had expected, had perhaps feared, that when the moment came, she would feel the sharp satisfaction of vindication, the thing that everyone who has been dismissed and doubted secretly rehearses. She felt something quieter and more tired instead. A sorrow for the distance between what was possible and what people choose to believe until they have no other option. She had told them. She had gone door to door and told them, and they had closed their doors. She had opened hers. That was the whole story. It didn't need a sharper edge than that. The Reverend sat against the north wall with his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes moving around the curved space with an expression she could not fully read. At one point, Owen passed near him with a tin cup of water. The Reverend accepted it. He held it in both hands and looked down at it and said nothing. Later, much later, deep into the night when most of the others had found their way to an uneasy sleep, Edith became aware that he was watching her from across the curved space. Not with hostility, with something more complicated. She met his gaze. She held it without challenge or invitation. Simply, she was there, and he was looking. And both things were permitted. He looked away first. What a man carries in his conscience is his own work to do. And she had enough work already. The night had a quality she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the specific details, not the sequence of events, but the texture of it. The sound of 11 people breathing in a sealed space during a storm that was doing its worst outside and failing to reach them. The steady warmth of a place that holds heat the way she had designed it, not dramatically, not with the feverish intensity of an overstoked fire, but with the patient warmth of something that has simply decided not to let the cold win. Children sleep in the most complete way, in the way that adults lose at some point without noticing. The children slept. The adults rested in fragments, waking when the wind shifted, when someone moved, when a child made a sound. But resting was enough. Resting was the first step back from the edge. The body, given even partial rest, begins to recalculate, begins to move the resources it has been spending on crisis back toward ordinary function, begins, in the most fundamental sense, to heal. Edith tended the stove through the night, small additions, frequent, maintaining the calibrated burn she had spent weeks perfecting. She checked the walls. She kept a mental count of the cups of water distributed, the blankets distributed, the approximate state of each person based on the color of their skin, and the clarity of their eyes, and whether their hands, when she touched them, had regained their ability to grip. They were all stabilizing, some more slowly than others, but the direction was consistent. That was enough. It was Callum's daughter who broke the silence in the deep middle of the night. She was 4 years old enough to have language, young enough that language was still closer to truth than it is in adults. She had been asleep for several hours, tucked against her father's side in the warmest part of the floor. Owen had placed Biscuit near her when she first arrived, and the dog had stayed, solid and gray-muzzled and entirely certain of his purpose. The girl woke. She looked at the dog. She looked around at the people sleeping in the curved space. She looked at the warm walls. "Is the dog warm?" she said. Her voice, in the quiet of the sealed space, was very clear. No one was fully asleep. Everyone heard it. The space went still in a way it had not been still before. A different stillness, not the stillness of exhaustion, but the stillness of people who have been handed something unexpected and are trying to understand its weight. Owen, who had been sitting near the stove, looked at the girl, then at Biscuit. Then he said, with complete seriousness, "He's always warm. He keeps himself warm." The girl considered this. Then she put her hand on the dog's back, and Biscuit turned his head and looked at her, and his tail moved twice on the blanket beneath him. Not an energetic wag, just a slow acknowledgement, the way old dogs confirm what they already know. The girl lay back down. Edith looked at Callum Briggs. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his daughter's hand on Biscuit's back. His face had changed. It was not the same face that had stood behind the property man in his good coat and delivered a legal document to a woman building something he'd decided was worthless. It was a different face, the face that exists underneath the certainty, the face that certainty is sometimes built to protect. He looked at his daughter and the dog and his wife's hand resting on his arm. Some things require only the moment of contact. Child, animal, warmth, the knowledge that you almost lost this and did not, and that the reason you did not is the woman sitting across the room whom you called a fool. That knowledge sat in Callum Briggs's face like something that had finally arrived after a long journey. He did not look at Edith. He looked at his daughter. That was enough. That was, in some ways, more than enough. It was late, so late it had gone around the back of night and was approaching something like pre-dawn, when Winifred's words came back to her. The Reverend moved, carefully and quietly, to sit nearer the stove. Not next to Edith, a few feet away, on the other side of the small cleared space. He sat with his hands around a tin cup that had long since gone cold, and he looked at the stove's window, the small glass panel through which the flame was visible, low and orange, a contained and patient light. After a while, he said, I told the congregation to trust Providence. He was not speaking to her exactly. He was speaking in the direction of the flame. Edith said nothing. I've been trying to determine, he continued, whether what is in this room constitutes providence, or an argument against my understanding of it. A pause. I haven't resolved that yet. My father used to say, she said, that providence and preparation were not in competition. That if you were given a mind that could understand how heat works, ignoring that understanding was its own kind of ingratitude. The Reverend was quiet for a moment. That's an interesting theology, he said. It kept us warm, she said. He exhaled, not quite a laugh, but in the direction of one. Then his head drooped slightly, and he slept in the chair-like lean of a man who has finally run out of reasons to remain awake. The knock came in the last darkness before dawn. Biscuit heard it first. His head lifted, his ears rotated. A second later, Edith heard it too. She crossed the space, opened the inner door into the barn's outer shell, moved to the main door, and worked the latch. It had frozen slightly overnight, required more force than usual. She noted that, filed it. She opened the door. Damon Frey stood in the snow. He had been outside in this for some portion of the night. That was visible in everything about him. The ice in the crease of his coat, the rawness of his face where the wind had worked at it, the particular stillness of a person who has been spending energy on movement for a long time and has arrived at the end of what they had to spend. He had a cut along his jaw, shallow, the kind that comes from something passing too close in the dark. His hat was gone. One of his gloves was missing, and the hand without it had passed beyond the productive pain of cold exposure into the flat numbness that comes after. He looked at her. I should have come sooner, he said. His voice was rough, eroded by cold and whatever he had moved through to get here. But it was direct. It was the most honest sentence he knew how to construct, and he had constructed it with everything he had left. She stepped back. Come in, she said. Get warm. The same words she had said 11 times before him. The same words she had built this whole space to be able to say. But they sat differently in her mouth now. Not because she meant them differently, but because he heard them differently. And she knew that. And the knowing changed the weight of the air between them for just a moment before she stepped fully back and let him through the door. She guided him to the stove. She examined his ungloved hand, the right one, the color of winter birch bark, the color that means the warming must be done slowly, without rushing. She positioned it near, not at, the stove's warmth, in the graduated approach her father had described, and she had now practiced twice tonight already. Owen woke when Frey entered. He looked at the man, then at his mother, then at Biscuit, who had stood when the door opened and now, after a moment of assessment, lay back down. The dog's judgment being, as it had been all winter, the clearest available. Owen lay back down too. Frey sat by the stove. Color began to return to his hand in the slow, reliable way that means the damage has not gone past what the body can reclaim. He looked around the space, at the people sleeping, at the children, at Callum Briggs against the south wall with his daughter, at the Reverend in his dozing lean. How many? He asked quietly. 11, she said. 12 now. He looked at her. She looked at the stove. You built it for this, he said, not a question. I built it to survive the winter, she said. This is part of that. He was quiet for a moment. The council, it doesn't matter right now, she said. It didn't. Whatever had been said, whatever calculation he had made, and then, at some point in the depth of this night, unmade, none of it was the most important thing in the room. The most important thing in the room was 12 people who were warm when they should not have been, in a structure that held when everything around it hadn't. The rest could be handled when the storm ended. Frey nodded. He understood the hierarchy. He looked at the curved walls, the smooth, sealed surface of the foam-covered steel, the clean geometry of the arches rising overhead. In the low light of the stove, the space had a quality that was difficult to name. Not beautiful exactly, though it was that. More than that. The quality of something that has been built for a real purpose and is fulfilling it. The quality of rightness. Whose design? He asked. A man who died before he could build it, she said. And my father. And mine. Frey looked at the arches for another moment. It's a good piece of work, he said. Yes, she said. It is. The storm pressed against the old barn's outer walls with the same sustained force it had maintained all night. The steel held. The foam held. The warmth held. And inside the space, 12 people breathed the same air in a structure that had been built to shelter exactly this many, by a woman who had been told she wouldn't see the far side of winter. She was seeing it. It was not yet dawn, but it was coming. The way things that have been earned always come. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the patient, inevitable certainty of something that has been moving toward you for a long time and has finally arrived. She put her hand on the stove's warm surface for just a moment. An old habit, a check, a confirmation that the burn was where she wanted it. And then she sat down beside the man who had come through the storm to be the 12th person in a space built for 12. Neither of them spoke. The fire burned low and steady. Outside, the last darkness before dawn pressed against the barn walls, and the steel held its shape, and the warmth held its ground, and the night moved, slowly, toward morning. The storm ended the way serious things end, not with drama, but with an absence. She noticed it first in the quality of the sound. The pressure against the outer walls had been constant for so long that it had become a kind of silence itself, a noise so sustained it no longer registered as noise. When it shifted, when the wind began to ease, and then ease further, and then settle into something that was merely cold, rather than violent, the change arrived as a new quiet, deeper than the old one. She had been awake through most of it. The fatigue in her body had gone past sensation into a flatness, a simplification of awareness down to what was necessary. She felt the change in the storm and noted it and kept the stove at its calibrated burn, because the ending of a storm is not the ending of cold. And she had learned over the course of this winter not to confuse relief with safety. Others woke in pieces, children first, as always, surfacing with the quick, clear eyes of creatures whose nervous systems have not yet learned to manufacture exhaustion. Owen was among the first. He looked at Frey, who had fallen asleep in his chair lean by the stove some time before dawn, then looked at his mother, and she gave him the small nod that meant, "Yes, he came. Yes, it's all right. Yes, we will discuss it at some point. That is not right now." Owen accepted this with the trust of a child who has learned that his mother's small nods are reliable. He went to check on Biscuit, then the stove. Then he began, quietly and without being asked, to refill the tin cups with water from the barrel. The people of Harrow Hollow stepped outside into a world that had been reorganized without their permission, The storm had not destroyed the town. It had not needed to. What it had done was more precise. It had tested every structure and every system and every assumption, and the results were visible in what remained and what didn't, in what had held and what had bent, in the gaps where things had been and were no longer. Several roofs had failed, not collapsed entirely, but compromised in ways that would take real work to repair. Wood piles that had seemed sufficient were revealed as precisely sufficient, measured exactly against ordinary conditions, and found wanting when those conditions changed. Structures adequate in ordinary cold had proven to be only that, adequate to the ordinary and no further. Edith walked the street alone that first morning. She walked because she needed to understand what had happened, and because there is a particular solitude available in the aftermath of serious weather that is different from ordinary solitude. Heavier, more honest, containing within it the recent past in a way that ordinary quiet does not. She was looking, as she always looked, at structures, at what had held and why, at what had failed and why. She came to the house at the eastern edge of town, a small house, neat, or it had been. An old man lived there alone. Had lived there alone, she corrected herself, because the past tense was already necessary and honesty required using it. She had passed this house on her warning rounds, had knocked, had stood in the doorway and delivered the same information she had delivered everywhere. He had not answered. She had moved on. She knew now. The structure was intact. The walls had held. But the chimney showed the signs of a fire that had burned through its fuel sometime in the night and had not been tended. The door was sealed from the outside by drifted snow. She cleared it and opened it. Inside was very cold, very still. The particular stillness that is not simply absence of movement. She stood in the doorway and did not look away. Her father had taught her that looking clearly at difficult things, of not softening them prematurely or turning away before the full weight had been received, was not cruelty. It was the only honest form of attention available. A death looked at clearly becomes something that can be carried. A death looked away from becomes something that follows you instead. One man had not made it, not because the storm was unsurvivable. She had proven that in the curved space of her barn, where 12 people had weathered what this town's structures could not. This particular death had not been inevitable. He had not made it because no one had reached him in time, because the same collective certainty that had kept people from listening to her warning had kept them from checking on their neighbors in the hours when checking might have mattered. Because a community that waits too long to ask for help also waits too long to offer it. And both failures come from the same source. She was not angry. She was sad. The specific sadness of a death that did not have to happen, which carries a different weight from the sadness of a death that could not have been prevented. She would carry this weight carefully. Let it be the reason precision mattered. Let it be the reason she never again assumed that warning someone once was enough. She closed the door. She stood outside his house in the altered morning light and said nothing, because there was no one to say anything to, and sometimes silence is the only honest response available. Then she walked back slowly through the transformed snow toward her barn. Not because her legs were tired. They were, but that wasn't why. Because some things deserve to be carried at walking pace. Callum Briggs found her in the afternoon. He came alone, without his wife, without the property man, without any of the apparatus of the position he usually occupied. He wore his everyday coat, not the good one. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at the structure inside. The steel arches, the foam-sealed walls, the small stove burning in its offset corner, and studied it for a long time without speaking. Then he reached into his coat and produced the legal document. He had carried it since morning. She could tell from the way it was folded, along its original lines, but softened at the creases from handling, from being taken out and put back more than once before. He finally brought himself to come here. He unfolded it. He looked at it, not at Edith, at the document itself, with the expression of a man who has been carrying something that has become too heavy and has finally arrived at the place where he can set it down. He tore it in half, then in half again. He held the pieces and looked at them without performing the gesture, without making it larger than it was, which was the thing she respected most about it. He set the pieces on the workbench. He looked at the structure. The thermal retention, he said. The foam, that's what holds the warmth in. The foam and the mass of the steel, she said. And the shape. The curve directs heat down and around instead of letting it rise and escape. And the floor is sealed. Cold enters from the ground first. Most people don't account for that. He nodded slowly. He was not asking in order to argue. He was asking to understand, finally, the thing he had dismissed when dismissal had seemed like the safer form of certainty. I told people it wouldn't work, he said. I know. I said it publicly. He paused. More than once. Yes? He looked at her then, with the face of a man who had braced for sharpness and found something that required a different kind of response entirely. I was wrong, he said. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed in private, with the flatness of a sentence that has had the emotion worked out of it through repetition, leaving only the words. That was all right. The words were true, and sometimes that is what matters. You were working with what you knew, Edith said. He looked at her with the surprised attention of a man who had not expected that. That isn't an excuse, he said. No, she agreed, but it is a fact. And facts are more useful than condemnation. She looked at the torn pieces of the document on the workbench. The question is what you know now. He was quiet for a moment. Then, my daughter asked me last night why the ladies' barn was warm and ours wasn't. A pause. I didn't have an answer that wasn't shameful. Edith said nothing. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more precisely. I'd like to understand it properly, Callum said. The design. I'd just like to understand it. She looked at him. Come Thursday, she said. Bring paper. He came Thursday. He brought paper, and he listened with the specific attention of a man who has recently discovered that listening is a skill he had not been exercising, and that its absence cost him something real. Reverend Aldous came on his own, 2 days after Callum. He stood in the vaulted space and looked at the walls and the ceiling and the geometry of the structure with an expression that contained, she suspected, more than it showed. He did not apologize in direct terms. He was not built for direct apologies. She understood this about him now, and had made her peace with the variety of ways different people carry their conscience. What he said was, I gave a sermon this morning about the difference between faith and assumption, about how easily one can be mistaken for the other from the inside. He paused. I believe the congregation understood the application without being told. Edith nodded once. There is a family at the north end of the settlement, he said. Their outbuilding is inadequate for the winters ahead. I find that my thinking keeps returning to what you have built here. He looked at the arches. I would like to understand it well enough to be useful, if you would be willing to explain it. She looked at him for a long moment. Come Thursday as well, she said. Bring paper. He came Thursday, and he sat beside Callum Briggs at the workbench she had set up in the outer barn, and they listened together, which was not a thing either of them could have predicted, and which neither of them remarked upon, because what had happened in the storm had made certain observations unnecessary. She drew diagrams. She explained the principle, not as magic, not as intuition, but as physics. The behavior of air when held still, the behavior of mass when charged with warmth, the behavior of a sealed curve when cold pressure is applied from outside. She explained it in the plain language her father had used, which was the language of people who respect the intelligence of the person they are teaching. Both men took notes. Callum asked more questions than the Reverend. The Reverend's questions were fewer, but went to different places, to the underlying principle rather than the specific application. Both kinds of questions were useful, and she answered both with equal care. Before he left, the Reverend paused at the door. The family at the north end. I'll bring them Thursday as well, if that's acceptable. It was. When they left, she stood in the barn doorway and watched them walk back toward town, and she thought of the dead man whose plans had started all of this, and she thought of Winifred's composed eyes, and she thought of her father on those long evenings when the light lasted and the lessons went on past when they were supposed to stop because neither of them wanted to end them. The knowledge is not the building. The knowledge is what you give away. She went back inside and added wood to the stove. The legal matter resolved itself quietly, the way things resolve when the force maintaining them has been withdrawn. The county office sent confirmation. Her name appeared where it belonged on the record. She held the document for a moment. Then she placed it in the tin box with the dead man's plans, and the journal, and the old letters, and the letter she had written after Winifred's death. The box was getting full. That seemed right. Damon Frey asked her to marry him on a morning in early spring, when the snow had pulled back from the southern slope of the hill, and the first pale green was showing at the base of the dead grass. The particular pale green that means the ground has decided, beneath its surface, to begin again. He stood in the inner doorway of the barn, the threshold between the outer shell and the vaulted space, the place she thought of as the boundary between the world that assessed from the outside and the world that knew from within. And he said, I'd like to make what we have into something formal, if you're willing. I think you know what I mean, and I think you know I mean it. She had known it was coming. She had known since the morning he arrived through the storm, since the moment she had seen him in the doorway with his missing glove and his cut jaw, and the exhaustion of a man who has made a decision and acted on it regardless of cost. She had understood then what that meant, even if she hadn't allowed herself to fully name it. Owen had known before she did. She had seen it in the particular quality of his stillness during Frey's recent visits, the look of a child who is running a careful internal calculation and has arrived at a result he approves of, and is waiting, with imperfect patience, for the adults to arrive at the same place. She looked at Frey in the doorway. Yes, she said, I'm willing. Owen appeared from the outer barn with the specific timing of a person who had absolutely not been standing on the other side of the wall listening, walked directly to Biscuit and began examining the dog's paws for ice with an attention to detail that the task did not strictly require. Biscuit submitted to this examination with the dignity of an animal that understands when it is being used as a conversational prop and has decided to be gracious about it. Edith watched her son and felt something that lived past the range of the words she had available for feelings. Something warm and structural, the way the warmth in the barn was structural. Not a temporary event, but a sustained condition. They married that summer in the vaulted space of the barn, because it was the place that had made everything else possible. And because the people who came to witness it understood what that meant. Winifred Oakes did not come. She was past coming anywhere by then. But she sent, through the neighbor who still ran errands for her, a small wrapped parcel that turned out to contain her husband's compass. A surveying instrument, old and precise, the kind of tool that exists to establish exactly where you are and what direction you are facing. Inside the wrapping, in the old woman's handwriting, a single line, for the next chapter of the same story. Edith placed the compass on the shelf beside the tin box. Winifred died that autumn. She died in her own bed, in her own house, with the peace of a person who was arranged to finish the things that needed finishing before the arrangement became necessary. Edith sat with the absence for a while in the old woman's quiet house, in the early morning light that was the color of the first day she had spent in Harrow Hollow, when the sky had sat low and heavy and the hills had been the color of old iron. She went home and wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, just a letter, the kind people write to put their thoughts in order. She wrote about the chain of knowledge, about how it moved through people rather than remaining with them, how it changed form at each transmission but maintained its essential truth, how each person who understood it became responsible for passing it on. She wrote about the difference between knowing a thing and giving it away, and how the giving was the part that made it permanent. She folded the letter and placed it in the tin box. The box was nearly full. She would need a larger box eventually, or more boxes, which was, she thought, exactly as it should be. Owen left for his engineering studies on a morning when the light had the particular quality of autumn light that looks like it is trying to memorize everything before it has to change. Before he left, he spent a morning in the barn alone. She gave him the space because she understood what he was doing. The same thing she had done on her first evening there, standing in the center of the broken structure and looking up at what it could contain. He was encoding the space, committing it to the kind of memory that lives in the hands and the body rather than in language. The memory that can be recalled in the act of building rather than in the act of speaking. When he came out, he stood beside her and looked at the barn's outer shell, old and weathered and still standing, the leaning wall no more inclined toward the ground than it had been the day she arrived. The curve, he said, it's not just for strength. No, it directs the heat down and around instead of up and out. Yes, he was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was not done thinking. Grandpa understood that, he said. The man who drew the plans understood it. You understood it. He paused. They all found the same thing. They understood the same principle, she said, through different materials, different circumstances, different languages almost. She looked at the barn. The principle doesn't care about any of that. It just waits until someone finds it. Owen nodded, filing this away with the careful patience she had noticed over the years, a manner increasingly his grandfather's, the patience of a person who trusts that the thing being stored will be available when it is needed. He picked up his bag. He turned back once at the gate. The shape of a thing, he said. determines what it can survive, she said. He nodded and left. He came back years later with a quietness about him that was different from the quietness he had left with. Deeper, more inhabited. He had built things. Good things, not famous things, but sound things. Structures made for people who needed shelter that worked rather than shelter that looked correct. In each of them, he told her one evening, there was something he had taken from the barn. Not always the thermal mass, he said. Sometimes just the principle that the shape is not incidental, that the shape is the decision. She listened to him describe the buildings in 3 different places, all different climates, all different materials. The principle was present in all of them, adapted rather than copied, which was exactly right. Adaptation was how knowledge traveled through generations without calcifying into rule rather than remaining alive as understanding. He described one building in particular, a small structure he had designed for a family in a cold northern valley where the winters arrived early and stayed late, and the people who lived there had few resources and less margin for failure. He had spent more time on that design than on any of the others. He had gone back 3 times after the first winter to measure, to ask, to adjust. The family had invited him to stay for dinner on his second visit, and he had sat at their table while the snow came down outside and the interior held its warmth exactly as he had calculated. And he had thought of his mother standing in a cold barn in the early dark with 3 matches and a tin of plans she had found under a rotted floor, deciding this was a beginning. He had not told the family where the design came from. He had not felt the need to. The design spoke for itself. But he had thought of her, and of the dead man who had drawn the plans before her, and of the grandfather he had never met who had passed the principle to her father who had passed it to her, and he had sat at that family's table in the warm interior of a building he had made from an understanding he had inherited, and he had felt, for the first time in his adult life, what it meant to be part of a chain rather than a beginning. He told her this. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather would have understood it the same way, she said finally. He called it the geometry of care. I never forgot that. The geometry of care, meaning the shape you build determines who you can shelter, and who you can shelter determines what kind of person you are becoming. Owen sat with that for a moment. You never told me he said that, he said. You weren't ready to hear it, she said. You are now. He had also begun teaching, not formally, but people asked him questions, and he answered them, and the answers led to more questions, and the conversation widened in the way conversations widen when they are rooted in something real. She did not say, that is what I did. She did not need to. The repetition of the pattern was its own statement. Biscuit died in the late summer of a year when the days were long and unhurried, and the light lasted past when light usually agreed to last. He died the way old dogs die when they have been well loved, with a gradual and dignified withdrawal, a slow pulling back from the world with the patience of a creature that has done what it came to do and is ready to rest. He had been slowing for months. Owen drove back when Edith sent word, and arrived in time, which was the only thing that mattered. They buried him at the edge of the property, in the ground under the old oak that had stood there longer than any of them, and would stand there longer than any of them. Owen made the marker from a piece of the original barn timber, dense old wood, the kind that has already endured everything wood can endure, and has nothing left to prove. He worked the letters carefully, with the patience his grandfather had given him through her. He kept watch. He kept us. Edith put her hand on the marker. She left it there for a moment, feeling the texture of the old wood, the letters her son had cut, the simple, true words. Then she looked at the barn, at the old outer shell, weathered and listing, and entirely itself. At the structure inside that was not visible from here, but that she knew with the knowledge of a person who has built something with their own hands, knew it from the curve of the steel under her palm, from the sound it made in different temperatures, from the quality of the air inside it when the stove had been running for 2 hours at its calibrated burn. She looked at it the way she had looked at it on the first evening she walked through it. Not at what it was, at what it had become. She did not have a word for what it had become. She had never needed one. The thing itself was sufficient. Many years later, when her granddaughter was old enough to ask the questions that people ask when they finally understand that the past is not past but present, they sat together in the vaulted space on a winter afternoon. The stove burned low. The foam-sealed walls held their warmth with the same patient efficiency they had always held it. Outside, the cold pressed against the old barn's boards, the way it had pressed against them every winter since the structure was built. Testing, measuring, looking for the weakness that was not there. The granddaughter looked at the curved ceiling. She was 7 years old and serious in the way that children are serious when they have decided something is important. "Did you really live here?" she asked. "When there was nothing. Wasn't it scary?" Edith looked at the arches above them, at the steel that had held its shape through everything that had been asked of it, at the warmth that would not be turned away. "Every single day," she said. The girl thought about this. "Then why didn't you leave?" Edith was quiet for a moment. She thought about the first evening, the cold floor, the 3 matches, Owen's question from the doorway in a voice that was trying to be braver than he felt. She thought about the tin box and the dead man's plans and Winifred's composed eyes. She thought about a legal document torn in 4 pieces on a workbench and a man arriving through a storm with 1 missing glove, and a dog buried under an oak tree with words carved in old wood above him. She thought about all the things she had not known when she was standing in this broken barn on that first evening, holding a dead man's plans against her chest and calling it a beginning. She had not known about Winifred or the journal or the letters beneath the false floor. She had not known that 11 people would one night sit with their backs against these walls and feel warmth that they had been certain was impossible. She had not known that Owen would grow into a man who carried the principle forward in his hands. She had not known that anyone would ever sit in this space and call it something worth preserving. She had only known that the barn needed finishing. "Because the barn needed finishing," she said. "And so did I." The girl looked at the walls, at the place where the foam met the steel in its continuous seal, the place where 2 materials had been made to work together in a way that neither of them could work alone. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "What great-grandfather taught you? Will you teach me how it works?" Edith looked at her granddaughter. The same question, coming around again. Not repeated. Continued. Carried forward in a new voice by someone young enough to not yet know the full weight of what she was asking to carry, which was precisely the right condition for asking. "Yes," Edith said, "I will teach you everything." The girl leaned into her side, the way Owen had leaned years and years before this. On a night when the fire was low and the cold was absolute, and the only thing between them and everything outside was a structure that held because its shape was right. The stove burned, the walls held. Outside, the winter did what winter always does: pressed, tested, waited. Inside, it found nothing to take. There was, among the people of Harrow Hollow, a shift that happened in the years that followed. Not sudden, not announced, but visible to anyone who knew how to look at the way a community changes when it has survived something together and understood the reason. The family at the north end of town, the ones Reverend Aldous had mentioned, built a new outbuilding the following autumn. It had a curved interior. The curve was not identical to Edith's. The materials were different, the dimensions different. But the principle was there, adapted to what they had and what they needed. Callum Briggs helped them with the framing. He did not speak much while he worked, but he worked carefully and well. 3 other structures in the surrounding area were modified over the next 2 winters. None of them were identical to each other. All of them reflected the same underlying understanding. Edith answered the questions as they came, from a doorway, at a workbench, across a fence line. The teaching was never formal. It was always specific, always responsive to the actual question being asked rather than the theoretical version of it. Callum, for his part, became something that Harrow Hollow had not expected from him, a man willing to be corrected. That shift, slower than the structural changes, was perhaps more significant. He still ran the general store. He still held opinions with the confidence that came from decades of being listened to. But there was a difference now. A pause before certainty. A willingness to ask before asserting that had not been there before the storm. His daughter noticed it first. She was too young to name it, but she felt it. Children always do. The young man, Pierce, who had laughed in the barn doorway and called out from across the yard on the day of the warning, came to Edith in the late spring of the following year. He came alone, which cost him something. And he was aware that it cost him something, and he came anyway. He did not apologize directly. She had not expected him to. He asked instead if she would explain how the stove offset worked, a specific, practical question. The kind of question a person asks when they are trying to build something real on the rubble of what they were before. She explained it. He listened. He came back 2 weeks later with a follow-up question. That was its own kind of apology, and she received it as such. Frey watched all of this from a position that was, by then, no longer that of an observer. He had his own questions sometimes, and he asked them directly, and she answered them the same way she answered everyone else's. Without condescension, without impatience, with the plain respect of someone who understands that a genuine question deserves a genuine answer. There were evenings in the years that followed when she would look around at what had grown up around the old barn. Not a settlement exactly, not a town within a town, but a community with a slightly different quality than it had possessed before. A community that had been tested and had found, in the testing, a more honest version of itself, not perfect. Communities are never perfect, but more honest, more willing to look at the gap between what they believed and what the evidence said, more willing to ask. She thought sometimes about the men who had watched her that first afternoon from the store, the ones who had nodded when Callum said she wouldn't last the winter. She did not think about them with bitterness. Bitterness requires a kind of sustained attention she had never been able to afford. She thought about them with something closer to compassion. the kind that comes from understanding that people believe what they have been given reason to believe, and that changing what you believe requires something most people only encounter in crisis. The storm had been that something. She was grateful for what it had saved. She was sad about what it had cost. Both things were true, and she held both without needing to resolve the tension between them. Owen came back during those years more often than distance strictly required. Each visit, he asked different questions than he had the time before. Questions that reflected what he had been building, what had worked, what had surprised him. The conversations lasted longer than they used to. Sometimes they lasted until the light changed and Frey came to find them both still talking at the workbench, surrounded by diagrams, and put a pot of something warm on the stove without interrupting. Those were good years, not uncomplicated, no years are, but built on something solid. The kind of years that don't float or soar. They simply hold. Decades later, a researcher came with instruments. He was a careful man, trained to verify rather than assume, to measure before concluding, to let the evidence arrive at the result rather than directing the result toward the evidence. He set up his equipment in the vaulted space and ran his measurements over 3 days, noting interior temperature across a range of exterior conditions, tracking the heat retention rate, mapping the relationship between the outer shell's exposure and the inner structure's response. His notes confirmed what Edith had calculated before the first steel panel was ever bolted into place. The structure performed exactly as designed. The thermal retention matched the dead man's predictions, adjusted by Edith's modifications, which in turn had been guided by the journal's documented failures. 3 people's understanding, layered into a single structure, each layer built on the last. He spent the first day with his instruments and his notebooks. He spent the second day reading the documents the family had given him, the plans, the journal, the old letters. He had expected technical material. He had not expected the texture of it, the way the dead man's failures were recorded with the same care as his successes, the way the corrections were written not in triumph but in the plain notation of someone who simply wanted to get the thing right. He had not expected the old letters, their formal language describing a principle across a century of different materials and different hands, each person adapting what they had received to what they needed. By the 3rd day, he had stopped writing measurements and had started writing something else. Notes that were less about what the instruments told him and more about what the box told him. About the shape of knowledge when it moves through people instead of staying with them. About what it means to document failure honestly, as though failure is simply another form of information, which it is. About the difference between a discovery and an inheritance, and whether that difference matters as much as he had always assumed. He asked the family if he could examine the original materials. They gave him the tin box. He held it carefully, understanding before he opened it that he was holding something that had passed through more hands than he would be able to fully trace. Inside, the plans, precise and aged, the journal, dense with a dead man's patient work, the old letters in their older handwriting, and one folded page in a different hand. A letter, not a calculation, filed with the rest as though it belonged there, which it did. He read it. In the middle of the 2nd page, a line stopped him. The knowledge is not the building. The knowledge is what you give away. He copied it into his notebook. He looked at it for a moment in the quiet of the vaulted space, with the stove burning low in its offset corner and the foam-sealed walls holding their warmth around him the way they had held warmth around 12 people on the worst night this town had ever produced. He was a researcher. He dealt in measurements and verifiable results, and the kind of truth that can be reproduced in controlled conditions. But he understood, sitting in that space, that what the box contained was not primarily a set of plans or a journal or a series of letters. What the box contained was a conversation that had been happening across generations, across different people in different circumstances with different materials, all of them finding their way to the same truth through different doors. A conversation about how to stay warm, about what warmth actually requires, about the difference between fighting cold and understanding it. He thought about his own work, the measurements, the publications, the careful accumulation of verified data. He thought about who had access to that data, and in what form, and whether anyone who needed it could find it and use it. He thought about the old letters in the tin box, written in a formal hand that had preserved something essential across a century, not because it was published or peer-reviewed or archived in any official sense, but because someone had folded it carefully and placed it under a false floor and trusted that eventually the right person would find it. He sat in the vaulted space for a long time after his measurements were complete. He closed the tin box and set it back on the shelf beside the surveying compass that had belonged to a man who died before he could finish the thing he had started. The Historical Society placed a marker on the property, a small one, simply worded. It named the structure and its builder, and what the structure had survived. It did not name everything else. It did not name the boy who grew into a man who built sound things in 3 different places. It did not name the woman with the composed eyes who gave away her husband's life's work because giving it away was the only way to complete it. It did not name the dog under the oak tree, or the man who came through the storm, or the torn pieces of a legal document that had never been filed. It did not name a granddaughter sitting in the warmth of an old barn, asking to be taught what the dead had left behind. It did not name a researcher who came with instruments and left with something he hadn't brought with him. A marker is a beginning, not a summary. The full weight of a life cannot be carved in stone. It can only be carried forward in the people who learned from it, who gave it away, who found the next person willing to receive it and asked, "Will you let me teach you?" And the answer, generation to generation, was the same. "Yes, teach me everything." The stove burned. The steel held its shape. The warmth built into those walls years before remained where it had always been. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was magic, but because the structure had been designed correctly, and correct design, maintained and passed forward, does not expire. Steel holds shape, and so do the ones who refuse to bend. If you are facing your own storm right now, if the cold is at your walls and the voices around you have already calculated your failure and announced it with the confidence of people who have never been wrong before, remember her. She arrived with nothing but a deed to land no one else wanted, a boy who had stopped laughing, and a box of plans drawn by a man she had never met for a building he never got to stand inside. She had no allies, no standing, no certainty. She had knowledge, the kind that had been passed to her by people who understood that what they knew was not theirs to keep, only to carry forward. She was terrified every single day. She built anyway, and the barn held.